The crystals sang before the words did. My father's knife grazed the rim of his wineglass, a clear note rising above the hum of conversation and the soft tick of the kitchen clock. The dining room light threw gold across the oak table, catching the bone-white china and the thin ribbon of steam lifting from the roast. I set my fork down and folded my napkin, steady hands under a steady face, while the room turned toward him like sunflowers to a window. First, David said, lifting his glass, "Here's to the good life, 65 trips around the sun." He grinned, the lines around his eyes deepening, and everyone chuckled on cue. Then he pivoted, shoulder-squaring voice, turning from warm to proud. But more importantly, I want to recognize what success and responsibility look like. My son is living proof. Across from me, Kyle smiled without showing his teeth. The Rolex on his wrist flashed when he adjusted his cuff. Vanessa leaned into his shoulder cheeks, bright, believing in the moment she wanted to be true. My mother dabbed an invisible spot from the tablecloth and beamed at her men. The house smelled like rosemary and slow-cooked meat. In the hallway, our childhood photos hung in straight lines. His baseball cap tilted my honor roll certificate half hidden behind a frame. "You never ask for handouts," my father said to Kyle, voice ringing with approval. "You stand on your own 2 feet." The knife in his hand shined like a silver underline. I felt the cut before he made it. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever sat through a toast that erased you, hit that like button and share this with someone who will understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. But to understand why that one sentence rattled the plates, you need to know where the ground under them was already cracked. I grew up in a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street outside Chicago Porch. Light on a timer, maple leaves clogging the gutter every fall, the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway at 6 a.m. I was the child who lined up pencils by length, who loved a clean page and a plan. By 3rd grade, I had an aluminum medal from the science fair and a shoebox full of spelling bee ribbons. The trophies sat in my closet neat as library books because the mantel was full of Kyle Little League snapshots and a scuffed baseball glued to a plaque that said, "Most improved." Of course, Lena did well, Dad would say, shrugging like weather. She always does. The first time Kyle brought home a C+, he got ice cream and a pat on the back for trying. When we were small, the house ran on my father's expectations like a furnace in winter, loud, constant, leaving rooms warm where he stood and cooler where he didn't. I learned the temperature of his attention early. If a piano recital overlapped with a game, my mother squeezed my shoulder and said, "You understand, right? You're more mature." I nodded because that was the job. On the nights I played anyway, the applause from strangers sounded like rain on a roof, comforting, but not meant for me. By 12, I was mowing lawns to buy my own textbooks and save for a laptop I would wear down to the letters. By 14, I was tutoring younger kids at the library and tracking my tiny stock purchases in a spiral notebook. When I showed my father that I'd made $300 in a month, he told me to focus on things that get you into a good college. Kyle slept late and made everyone laugh at breakfast. Somehow, that was also progress. I got into Northwestern with a partial scholarship. The number in the acceptance letter felt like a door cracked open. "We can do 2,000 a semester," Dad said, not unkindly. "It'll build character." I took 3 jobs, learned to live on 5 hours of sleep, and pinned my life to the rhythm of shift changes and office hours. I ate noodles over a sink and ran between lectures with wet hair because bathrooms with hand dryers doubled as salons when you were late. There is a particular quiet that settles in a campus library at 2 a.m., fluorescent lights humming above a few determined heads. I learned to love that quiet the way some people love church, a place where effort counts even if no one sees you kneel. I found my way to computer science the way you sometimes find the right street by accident, one turn because of rain, another because a light changed at the right second. An inventory algorithm I wrote impressed a professor, and he said the sentence that would glue a crack in me: "You see solutions where others only see problems." I folded those words like a note and kept them in my pocket for years. By the time my cap and gown arrived, my parents had tickets to Kyle's fraternity formal. "We'll catch your next milestone," my mother promised, as if they were buses with posted schedules. I picked up my diploma in a borrowed dress, smiled for a friend's camera, then drove back to my emptier apartment and packed boxes alone. The ache that follows pride settling behind my ribs like a second heart. California was a bet I made with my future. The Bay Air smelled like salt and possibility, and the garage my co-founders and I rented smelled like ramen and solder. We coded until sunrise and taped a whiteboard to the water heater. We had $20 between us some weeks, and I learned how to turn coffee into time. My father called occasionally with advice that felt like carefully folded criticism. "Apply to established companies," he'd say. "Benefits, stability." Meanwhile, Kyle changed majors and posted pictures from pool decks, then from behind the counter of a sports memorabilia shop, then in front of a food truck painted like a grilled cheese. Each new attempt was visionary until it closed. When our product landed on a tech blog's front page, the graphs in our analytics looked like a hill I'd been climbing, finally tilting the right way. We signed clients at a pace we could barely survive, took funding, and moved into an office with windows that caught the morning light like coins. Forbes put my face in their list, and I mailed my parents the magazine A Small Prayer in a padded envelope. "That's nice, dear," my mother said. "Did you know Kyle is thinking of starting his own business?" The condo I bought overlooked a strip of shining bay that went silver at dusk. On the first night I slept there, the city's hum felt like a hand on my back steadying. I stood at the window with a glass of water and tried the sentence out loud like a secret I did this. Then I put the glass down and wondered why the words dissolved so fast. A year later, during Thanksgiving at home, I brought photos of the team and stories of a bakery we'd helped stay open by untangling their payroll nightmare. My father set the photos aside for a story about Kyle's beer subscription idea and called it natural business instinct. After dinner, I stood by the sink and washed a pan until my fingers crinkled the window, showing me a rectangle of dark yard where our old swing set used to be. When Kyle called to confess, he sounded like a boy running to the house in rain without a jacket. "I'm in trouble," he said, and the details tumbled: credit cards, loans, 2 failed ventures, a third swaying. He was drowning and didn't want our parents to know which way was down. "They think I'm getting my act together," he said, voice soft with shame. I said yes. I said we'd keep it between us. I said $5,000 a month until he found the bottom and pushed off. I set conditions: a class on budgeting, steady work, a real plan. But the part that mattered wasn't the rules. It was the door I opened with a code only we knew. The transfers became a rhythm, a private calendar appointment that made my jaw clench and my heart loosen at the same time. The months turned into years. On family calls, my father compared his son's grit to my fancy tech job, and I pressed the phone between my ear and my shoulder and watched the payment clear. On social media, Kyle wore new suits and typed about landing clients. I liked the photos and sent the wire. Vanessa posted a picture of the ring oval, clean bright, and I stared at the screen until my eyes watered, unsure which part made my chest tighten harder, the beauty of her joy or the question of what it was built on. When my father's 65th birthday invitation arrived, it held 3 things: the date, the time, and the old imbalance folded like a place card. I checked into a hotel downtown and chose a burgundy dress that said, "Success without saying prove it." I bought him a limited edition watch and my mother a silk scarf, and I picked a leather portfolio for Kyle with his initials pressed into the corner. I remember tracing the letters with my thumb, thinking how heavy initials can feel when you're the one carrying them. The house hadn't changed: the crooked mailbox, the faded welcome mat, the clock in the hall that runs 5 minutes fast. In the living room, glass frames caught the lamplight. My father's blue sweater matched the veins at his temples. My mother inspected my dress with her eyes and smiled the way people do when they want to say 3 things and choose the kindest. Still in business, Dad asked when we sat as if my company were a lemonade stand he was humoring. "We're doing very well," I said, "because sometimes the truth and the quiet are the same size." Kyle arrived late, like a headline. He kissed our mother's cheek, clapped our father's shoulder, and nodded at me like a colleague from an industry event. The Rolex winked when he reached for the wine. Vanessa smelled like a florist's shop and happiness. My father's pride went from a simmer to a rolling boil in 5 seconds flat. Dinner was the kind of good that takes all day, roast carved into pink slices, potatoes crisp at the edges, green beans with a squeak. We talked about cruise brochures and golf handicaps and the weather because weather holds a family together when truth might not. I asked about the new neighbors and my mother's hydrangeas, and the ladder in the garage no one ever fixed. But my father's eyes had already moved to the speech he was rehearsing in his mouth, the one that would make sense of the story he'd been telling himself for decades. The blade tapped the glass, and the crystal note drew the room into its circle. "Success and responsibility," he said, looking at my brother like he was reciting a creed that's Kyle. He went on, choosing words like stones to build a pedestal, grit, determination, standing alone. Each landed where the last one had, stacking higher, closing out the sky. I felt the old heat rise, the flush you hide under steady breathing, the laughter you swallow because it would come out as a sob. My hands sat in my lap, one thumb turning the other like a slow wheel. The room smelled like cinnamon and candles. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice, impatient to be let in. My mother reached for the cake knife. Vanessa's smile flickered. Kyle stared at his plate as if it might give him an answer. In the hallway, a draft stirred the corner of a frame. The photo of my 5th grade science fair shifted by a fraction you could only see if you were looking for it. My father turned, lifted his glass toward me, and finished the sentence that would open every sealed door in the house. "Unlike you." The room went very still. The furnace kicked on. The candles fluttered just once. I folded my napkin with care and set it beside my plate, as if we were between courses and not between the past and whatever came next. Across the table, Kyle's jaw tightened, then loosened his hand, hovering over the watch he couldn't afford. In the space right after that sentence, and right before my own, I heard a sound that felt like truth clearing its throat. And I understood, without drama, without a raised voice, only with the sort of certainty that arrives like rain, that the part of me that had waited all my life was done waiting. Kyle's glass trembled when he set it down. The air around the table thickened, full of words no one wanted to claim. My father's eyes stayed fixed on me the way a man might stare at a reflection he didn't like, but refused to admit was his. My mother's hand hovered near the cake knife, then fell away. Somewhere behind us, the old clock struck 8, the sound stretching across the silence like a thread pulled too tight. No one spoke first. I could hear the faint rattle of the heating vent, the hum of a refrigerator down the hall, and the uneven rhythm of my own breathing. When I finally rose from my chair, the napkin I'd folded slid to the floor. Kyle stood too, muttering my name under his breath, but I didn't look at him. I had waited my whole life for one of them to see me. That night, I realized I had to see myself first. I left the dining room without saying goodbye. The house behind me felt smaller than it ever had, as if the walls had been holding their breath for decades and had finally exhaled. Outside, the air was sharp and wet with the smell of rain. My shoes clicked against the brick walkway as I walked to my car, my pulse steady and strange. It wasn't anger anymore. It was release, quiet, cold, and clean. The drive back to the hotel blurred into headlights and the faint drum of tires over asphalt. I didn't cry, not at first. I just replayed my father's toast in my head, the words that had once shaped my worth, and let them lose their power one by one. By the time I reached the city skyline, The tears came easily. They weren't from sadness, but from the exhaustion of holding myself upright for 31 years. Inside my suite, I set my phone on the desk and stared at it. It lit up every few seconds, a steady pulse of missed calls and messages. I didn't touch it. Instead, I ordered room service, changed into a soft sweater, and stood by the window watching the lights shimmer over Lake Michigan. Somewhere beneath those lights, my brother was unraveling. My parents were arguing, and the story they'd built around us was collapsing. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix it. When the tray arrived, chicken soup and a small loaf of bread, the young server gave me a polite smile and wished me a good night. His kindness, that simple courtesy, nearly broke me. I thanked him twice before closing the door. I ate slowly, every spoonful grounding me back in my own skin. When I finally picked up my phone, there were 23 texts and 17 missed calls. The first few were from my mother, pleading in gentle phrases that had soothed every past conflict. "Come back, we can talk about this," she wrote. "Your father didn't mean what he said." The next batch came from Kyle, short, frantic messages with no punctuation. "Please answer. You don't understand. Everything will fall apart." Then came my father's, angry at first, then confused, then uncertain. "This is ridiculous. Kyle would never lie about his work. How long have you been sending him money?" Why I scrolled through them all until the words blurred. Finally, near midnight, one new message appeared from Kyle. "I need that money. The apartment, the car, Vanessa's ring. It's all tied up. I'll lose everything. Please, call me." I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering above the screen, then turned the phone face down. My hands were trembling, but my chest was light. The truth had been spoken. Whether they could bear it or not was no longer mine to manage. Morning came slow and gray. The city was wrapped in mist, and the window pane was cool beneath my hand. I brewed the small pot of coffee on the counter and stood barefoot on the carpet, feeling the quiet stretch around me. By the time I'd finished the cup, a new message appeared, this one from my father. "Meet me for coffee. Just us." The words were plain, but the "just us" caught my attention. I replied with a simple yes. We met at a cafe 2 blocks from my hotel, one of those places where the air smells like roasted beans and steam. He arrived late, shoulder slumped, wearing the same sweater from the night before. When he saw me, something in his expression softened the authority that had always filled his posture, replaced by weariness. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me without small talk. "Kyle admits you've been sending him money," he began. His voice was rough, like he'd spent the night trying to talk sense into ghosts. "He says you're exaggerating, that it wasn't that much." I slid my phone across the table screen open to the bank statements. 180,000, I said quietly. Over 3 years. He blinked, studying the numbers as though the reality might rearrange itself if he stared long enough. "Why would he need that?" he asked finally. "He told us about all these clients, contracts, successes." "None of that was real," I said. "He has 2 small clients and debts that never went away. He's been living off those transfers." My father rubbed a hand over his face, thumb pressed against his temple. "Why didn't he come to us?" I wanted to laugh, but it came out as a sigh. "Because he couldn't bear to disappoint you," I said. "You've spent his whole life telling him he was destined for greatness. Admitting failure would shatter the story you built around him." He sat back silent. The steam from his coffee curled between us. "And why did you help him?" he asked finally. "If we treated you as unfairly as you think we did?" "Because he's my brother," I said. "And because I know what it feels like to think you'll never be enough." He looked down, hands clasped together, the knuckles pale. Have we really been that blind? Not cruel, I said. Just blind. For the first time in my life, my father didn't have an answer. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the tabletop, and we sat in a silence that felt less like distance and more like an opening. When I returned to my hotel, Kyle was waiting in the lobby. The bright confidence he carried like armor was gone. He looked smaller, his clothes plain, his eyes raw from lack of sleep. "We need to talk," he said, following me to a quiet corner near the elevators. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over one another. Vanessa threatening to postpone the wedding, their parents asking questions, his fear of losing everything. I listened without interrupting. When he paused for breath, I asked softly, "What did you expect, Kyle? That the lies would last forever?" "They weren't lies," he said, voice breaking. "I was going to make it all true. I just needed more time." "3 years isn't enough time?" I asked. He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "You don't understand what it's like. They told everyone I was special, successful, the one who'd make them proud. I couldn't let them down." That sentence landed heavier than I expected. I saw him then, not as the golden child who'd eclipsed me, but as someone crushed under a crown he never asked to wear. Still, sympathy didn't erase the damage. "You've been living off my work," I said quietly, "and you let them believe you earned it." He didn't deny it. "I was going to pay you back." When I asked, "After the next deal? After the next excuse?" His silence was answer enough. Finally, he whispered, "I have debts you don't even know about. Without your help, I'll have to declare bankruptcy. I'll lose the condo, the car, maybe Vanessa. Or," I said, "this could be your chance to stop pretending. Build something real." He looked at me, eyes red-rimmed, then nodded slowly. It was the first honest gesture I'd seen from him in years. The days that followed were full of messages, calls, and second-hand opinions from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were sympathetic, others scandalized. My mother's voice filled my voicemail every night, pleading, bargaining, blaming. "You're tearing the family apart," she said once. "Can't you see how much this is hurting your father?" But I'd spent too long carrying hurt that wasn't mine. I decided to stop answering. When I wasn't working, I walked the lakefront, letting the wind and the sound of gulls strip away what still clung to me. The silence became a kind of medicine. Each step along the water was a reminder that peace didn't always arrive with reconciliation. Sometimes it arrived when you stopped chasing it. Still, family habits die slowly. Every few days, I checked my messages, hoping for a shift in tone, a sign that they understood. Instead, I found more pleading. Kyle's voice messages were the hardest to hear, panic threaded through each one. "The bank's calling. The car's gone. Please, Lena, just help me one last time." I deleted them after listening, not out of cruelty, but to remind myself that enabling wasn't the same as love. My company kept me anchored. Between meetings and deadlines, I began to see how much space my family had taken up inside me. In their absence, my thoughts quieted, my sleep deepened. For the first time since childhood, I didn't wake with the weight of proving something. Then one evening, my Aunt Elizabeth called. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly a decade. "I've watched this play out your entire life," she said without preamble. "Your father did the same thing to me, favored our brother, ignored me. I left home at 18. It took me years to realize he was just repeating what his father did to him." Her words settled like stones in calm water. "What would you have done differently?" I asked. "Exactly what you're doing now," she said. "Standing your ground, but not shutting the door. Let them come to you when they're ready." It was the kindest advice anyone had given me. I thanked her, and when the call ended, I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the dark glass. Maybe this was what growth looked like, not triumph or vindication, but understanding. Weeks passed. The chaos back home continued to unfold. Kyle lost his office lease and sold off most of what he'd flaunted. Vanessa postponed the wedding. Family gossip traveled faster than truth ever had, and I became the quiet villain in their retellings, the one who'd exposed the illusion. It hurt less than I expected. Distance gives pain a smaller echo. I focused on my work and on small routines that steadied me. Morning coffee before dawn. Evening walks when the streets turned gold. Therapy sessions where I learned to name things I'd only ever felt. "You've built your identity around earning love," my therapist said once. "Now you're learning to live without that transaction." Her words stayed with me. I thought about them the night my mother left a voicemail whispering that my father wasn't sleeping. I didn't answer, but I lit a candle by the window and let it burn until morning. Some gestures don't need to be seen to mean something. When the candle burned low, I realized the silence didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like space, wide calm, waiting. What came next, I didn't yet know. But for the first time in my life, the story I was living belonged entirely to me. The first morning I woke up without a single family message waiting for me felt strange. Quiet, but not empty. I poured coffee and stood by the window as sunlight came through in long ribbons. The silence no longer pressed, it simply existed. It took weeks of space before I understood that quiet didn't mean loneliness. It meant air. By then, the fallout had grown its own shape. My parents had moved from anger to confusion, and finally into something I could only describe as disbelief. My father's pride had always been the engine of our household. Now it sputtered. My mother's guilt came out in apologies that stopped halfway through sentences. Kyle was still unraveling, losing things one by one: the office, the condo, the car. But in that loss, he was finally meeting the world on its own terms. I stayed in San Francisco, focusing on work. The office windows overlooked the bay where fog rolled in slow like breath. I spent long evenings with my team planning our next expansion, and I began to feel steady again, grounded in something I'd built myself. But every night when the city dimmed, thoughts of home returned like a tide never gone, only retreating until the next pull. It was around then that Vanessa reached out. Her message was brief, polite, but heavy with unspoken things. She asked if we could meet. I agreed, and 2 days later, she arrived at a small cafe near my office. She looked tired, but composed, her hair pulled back, her hands restless around the cup. "He's been lying about everything," she said after a long silence. "Not just the money or the business. The apartment we lived in, it's rented under my name. He used my credit. I'm covering rent I didn't know I owed." She twisted the ring on her finger, then slipped it off and set it on the table. "I thought we were planning a wedding. Now I don't even know who I'm engaged to." I didn't try to soften it. "He's been living inside an illusion for years," I said quietly. "Maybe now he's being forced to step out of it." She nodded slowly, eyes wet but steady. "I think I still love him," she whispered. "But I can't keep pretending too." I gave her the name of a contact in our company's marketing department, a mentor program we ran for women in tech. "You have real skill," I said. "If you ever want a fresh start, this might be worth looking into." Her surprise flickered into something close to relief. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because you didn't build this lie," I said. "You just believed someone who was afraid to tell the truth." When she left, she squeezed my hand once and promised to stay in touch. Watching her go, I realized that empathy didn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it was just refusing to let bitterness write the rest of your story. Days later, I received an email from my COO, Olivia Chen, asking if I could meet privately. We'd worked side by side for years through sleepless launches and near-broken budgets. After the meeting, she lingered in the doorway. "You've been distant," she said gently. "Is everything all right?" I told her what had happened carefully without dramatics. When I finished, she studied me for a long moment. "It makes sense now," she said. "You're decisive in business but hesitant with yourself. You don't need to keep proving anything, Lena." Her words stayed with me. That afternoon, between calls and meetings, I searched online for a therapist who specialized in family dynamics. I found one with calm eyes and a name that sounded like patient's Dr. Maria Martinez. Our first session was quiet, almost awkward. She asked me to describe my family without explaining them. It took longer than I expected. By the third session, she said, "You spent your life earning love by performing competence. That pattern doesn't vanish when you succeed. It just changes its shape." I sat with that. It felt like a truth I had known but never dared to name. Weeks passed into months. My boundary with the family remained a pause, not a wall. My mother still called, leaving small updates in soft tones. The dog needed surgery, the hydrangeas bloomed early, my father was golfing less. She avoided the deeper topics as if mentioning them might tear what little peace we'd managed. I let her. One evening, my father's name appeared on my phone. Against instinct, I answered. His voice was rough but calm. "Kyle's been working," he said, "at an agency downtown. Entry level, but steady." "That's good," I said. There was a pause long enough to hear his breath. "He told me he's seeing a therapist too," he added. "Says it's helping." It was the first time my father had called to tell me about progress, not pride. I thanked him, and before hanging up, he said something I hadn't expected. "Your mother misses you." "I do too." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen counter for a long time, fingers tracing the edge of a coffee mug. Maybe change didn't come as apologies or grand gestures. Maybe it came in the smallest words spoken quietly enough to hear the truth beneath them. The next month, my company prepared for an international expansion, our first European branch. I buried myself in contracts and calls, working 12-hour days. Yet in the quiet hours after midnight, I found my thoughts returning to home, not the pain, but the possibility of something new. It was then that Kyle reached out again. His message was short. "Can we talk, not about money, about moving forward?" We met at a small cafe near the river during my next trip to Chicago. The last time I'd seen him, he was unraveling. Now his posture was different, smaller, but steadier. His clothes were simple, no watch glinting on his wrist. He looked like someone beginning again. "I took a job," he said, "marketing coordinator. It's not glamorous, but it's real." I nodded. "How's it going?" He smiled faintly. "Humbling, but good. I can finally sleep." We talked for nearly 2 hours, not as rivals or repairers, but as siblings. He told me about his bankruptcy, filing the therapy sessions, the way Vanessa had chosen to step back but still check in. "I don't know if she'll take me back," he said, "but I'm learning to stop asking others to hold me up." There was sincerity in his eyes, not the old charm, but something quieter. For the first time, I believed him. Before we left, he looked at me across the small table. "I'm sorry, Lena," he said. "Not just for the money. For letting them use you as the measuring stick while I pretended not to notice." I nodded, too moved to speak. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive as words, it settles, as a shared silence, the kind that doesn't need to fill itself. That night, I walked along the river where the city lights wavered on the water. The air smelled like rain, the kind that never quite falls. Somewhere inside me, an old ache loosened. Not gone, just less sharp. Weeks later, my parents suggested a family meeting with a counselor. I hesitated, but agreed. We gathered in a neutral office with framed photos of calm beaches on the walls. The therapist, a middle-aged man named Harold Peters, invited us to speak without interruption. My father began stiffly defending, explaining. My mother cried, then tried to smooth everything into past tense. Kyle spoke quietly about pressure and expectation, about never feeling allowed to fail. When it was my turn, I simply said, I wanted recognition, not because I needed praise, but because I wanted to belong. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then my father exhaled a sound halfway between a sigh and surrender. I may have been harder on you than I realized, he said. I thought strength would protect you. It wasn't an apology, not completely, but it was real. That was enough. When the session ended, my mother hugged me longer than she ever had before. Her hands trembled slightly. I never understood your world, she said. I was proud, but afraid to say the wrong thing. It's not too late, I told her. As we left, the late afternoon light slanted through the window, landing on the space between us. It felt like something closing, or maybe something finally opening. Back in San Francisco, I returned to work with a lighter heart. The office buzzed with plans for expansion, laughter between meetings, the clatter of keyboards. Outside, gulls wheeled over the bay, their shadows sliding across the glass. That evening, as I shut down my computer, I thought about how far we had all come from illusions built on denial to the fragile beginnings of truth. There were still cracks, still memories that stung, but they no longer defined me. When I got home, I found a message waiting from Vanessa. She had accepted the marketing position at our Chicago office. It feels strange, she wrote, but it feels right. Thank you for seeing something in me when I couldn't. I smiled, setting the phone down. Life had a way of stitching small redemptions where we least expected them. Outside, the city lights blinked against the water, steady and forgiving. Somewhere in the quiet hum of the evening, I realized I no longer needed anyone else to tell me who I was. I had already chosen. And for the first time in a long time, that choice felt like peace. The first hint that something inside my family had truly shifted came months later on a quiet morning in Chicago. The city was wrapped in a thin winter fog, soft enough to blur the buildings, the kind that makes every sound feel distant. I had returned for a short business trip and agreed to have coffee with my father. He chose the same diner we'd gone to when I was a child, the one near the corner of Maple Avenue, where the same red booths and chrome counter still gleamed beneath fluorescent lights. He was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee cup. His face looked older than I remembered, tired in a way pride could no longer conceal. When he looked up, he smiled, but it was a small, uncertain one. You look well, he said, as though the words themselves might break the silence between us. So do you, I answered, sliding into the booth across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waitress poured coffee into my cup, steam curling between us like a bridge we hadn't decided to cross. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, I may have been harder on you than I should have been. Too quick to praise Kyle for things I should have expected from him. Too slow to tell you I was proud. He looked down at his hands, large and square, turning the cup in slow circles. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was real. It was enough. Thank you, I said simply. When I left the diner, the fog had lifted just enough for the sunlight to break through in pale strips across the street. For the first time in years, I didn't carry the weight of an unfinished conversation. Back in San Francisco, the days unfolded quietly. My company was thriving. Our expansion into Europe had taken off faster than expected. my calendar filled with strategy meetings, calls at odd hours, and the steady hum of progress. Yet beneath the noise of growth, I began to feel something I hadn't in years. A calm sense of balance. Dr. Martinez called it differentiation, the ability to define yourself apart from your family without cutting them away. During one of our sessions, she said, "It's like learning to breathe in your own rhythm while still standing in the same room." That image stayed with me. I started visiting Chicago more often, not out of obligation, but from a quiet willingness to see what healing might look like in motion. Each visit was a test, small and deliberate. My mother's hugs lasted longer. My father listened more than he spoke, and Kyle was becoming someone I didn't have to rescue anymore. He invited me to lunch one afternoon at a modest cafe near his office. He wore a navy shirt and a smile that didn't look borrowed. "They promoted me," he said, a little shy, almost disbelieving. "Team lead, I actually earned this one." "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. He leaned back, exhaling like someone who'd been underwater too long. "It feels different," he admitted, not pretending, not owing anyone. As we ate, he told me about a few small successes and a few failures too, without flinching. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, I realized that the shame that used to hang between us had quietly dissolved. Vanessa joined us near the end of the meal, waving from the door. Her smile was hesitant but warm. She had started working for the Chicago branch of my company, and her confidence showed. After Kyle excused himself to take a call, she looked at me and said softly, "Thank you for giving me a chance. I don't think I would have found my footing without that." "You found it yourself," I said. "You just needed someone to see it." When Kyle returned, they shared a look that spoke of cautious peace. Whatever they had lost, they were rebuilding on truth, not illusion. Back at my hotel that evening, I sat by the window and watched the skyline blush with sunset. I thought about how life sometimes repairs itself, not with grand apologies, but with quiet, consistent effort. My family was still imperfect, maybe always would be, but the edges had softened. Weeks passed into months again. I returned to San Francisco just as spring began to paint the city green. Work kept me busy, but not consumed. I joined a mentorship program for young women in tech, most of them first-generation professionals, struggling with the same need for validation that had driven me for years. One of them, a shy software engineer named Maya, reminded me of my younger self, sharp, capable, but hesitant to take credit. After one meeting, she lingered behind and asked, "Did you ever feel like you had to prove you belonged before you could believe it yourself?" "All the time," I said. But eventually, I realized the only proof I needed was to keep showing up. Her small, grateful smile was the kind that echoed for days afterward. Helping others find their footing filled something inside me I hadn't realized was still hollow. That summer, I traveled back to Chicago for a family dinner, this time at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river, not the old dining room where everything had once cracked open. Kyle and Vanessa arrived early. My parents followed, dressed neatly, their movements slower but gentler. The conversation flowed easily, at first updates about work, the weather, my mother's garden. When my father asked about my company, his tone was curious, not dismissive. I told him about our new initiative supporting small businesses owned by veterans. He listened carefully, nodding. "You always did find ways to make things better," he said at last. The words caught me off guard, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple and true. Dinner ended with laughter, real laughter that didn't hide tension. In the parking lot, as we said goodbye, my father stepped forward and hugged me. Not the formal kind, but something warmer, fuller. "I'm proud of you, Lena," he said quietly. "Not just for what you've built, but for who you've become." For a moment, I waited for the swell of emotion I'd imagined all my life, that rush of vindication, or closure. Instead, I just felt steady, whole. His words were kind, but they didn't define me anymore. They were just another piece of a story that was finally complete. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I stood by the window again. The city lights flickered below, reflecting off the dark water of the river. I thought about the long road between that painful dinner years ago and this quiet peace. I thought about the cost of pretending and the relief of truth, healing. I realized isn't about rewriting the past, it's about choosing not to live inside it. When I flew home the next morning, the sunrise stretched wide across the clouds, the kind of light that makes you forget where the horizon ends. I closed my eyes and let the warmth reach my face. There was no anger left, no need to prove anything. Only gratitude for distance, for growth, for the space that had allowed each of us to become honest again. Back in San Francisco, my office hummed with life. The glass walls shimmered with the reflection of a new day. My assistant handed me a letter that had arrived while I was away. It was from my father. The note was short. He'd written, "I hope you know how much you've taught us all about strength, about grace, and about what love looks like when it doesn't ask for repayment." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my planner. Not as proof. Just as a reminder of how far love can travel when you stop chasing it. Outside, the bay glimmered under the morning sun. Seagulls drifted above the water, and the wind carried the faint scent of salt through the open window. I stood there for a while, letting the noise of the city blend with the quiet inside me. Everything I'd ever tried to earn had already been mine. The dignity of my own worth, the peace of my own boundaries, the quiet joy of knowing I had finally stopped waiting for permission to be seen. And for the first time, the world felt wide open, exactly as it should. The morning after that letter arrived, I woke before dawn. The city was still half asleep, its edges softened by fog that rolled low over the bay. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stood by the window watching the lights shimmer across the water. The letter sat on the table beside a half-finished cup of tea folded neatly as if it had always belonged there. For the first time, my father's words didn't carry weight. They simply rested beside me, quiet and human. Outside, a gull cried somewhere in the mist, and the sound echoed faintly against the glass. It was a sound I'd heard countless times before, yet that morning it felt different, like something was answering back inside me. The ache that had followed me for so many years was no longer sharp. It had thinned into something gentler, a soft pulse of memory that no longer demanded attention. By 7, the city had begun to stir. I made coffee, the good kind I used to save for company, and let the smell fill the apartment. My phone buzzed with messages from my team overseas, updates, approvals, small successes. Each one was a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I'd built from nothing but belief and exhaustion. But beneath all that accomplishment, the truest victory was simpler. I had finally learned how to live without the constant need to be seen. Later that morning, I drove to the coast. The sun was still low, cutting bright paths across the Pacific, and the wind carried the scent of salt and pine. I parked near the cliffs and walked barefoot through the damp sand until the sound of the waves drowned out everything else. For years, I'd measured my life by what I had to prove: every degree, every contract, every headline, a small rebellion against the silence of my family's indifference. Standing there now, I realized I didn't need rebellion anymore. I just needed stillness. The tide came in slow and steady, washing away my footprints almost as soon as they were made. In the distance, a group of children ran laughing toward the water, their voices bright against the crash of waves. I watched them for a long while, smiling at the easy joy that once felt out of reach. It struck me then how healing rarely comes in one grand moment. It comes like the tide, quiet, steady, persistent, until one day you notice the pain has been worn smooth by time. That afternoon, I met Kyle for coffee before my flight. He was waiting by the window sleeves, rolled up, a notebook open beside him. His smile came easily now, without the old defensiveness behind it. "Vanessa got a promotion," he said as I sat down. "She's leading her own team at the Chicago office." "That's wonderful," I said. He nodded. "We're taking things slow, but it feels right this time. We're both different now." I could see it. The restlessness that once defined him had been replaced by something quieter: responsibility, humility, maybe even peace. He reached into his bag and slid an envelope across the table. "I've been setting money aside," he said. "It's not everything I owe you, but I wanted to start repaying what I can." I looked at the envelope but didn't open it. "You don't have to," I said softly. "I do," he replied. "Not for you, for me." The firmness in his voice made me smile. I placed my hand on his just for a second. "Then start by using it well," I said. "Build something real this time." He laughed under his breath. "That's the plan." When we parted at the curb, he hugged me, an unguarded, wordless gesture that carried every apology he couldn't fully speak. As I watched him walk away, shoulders straight against the late afternoon light, I knew the cycle had finally broken. On the flight home, I opened my notebook and began sketching out plans for a new mentorship program through the company, one that would focus on women starting businesses in overlooked communities. It wasn't about profit or recognition anymore. It was about offering what I once needed most: belief. Over the next months, the program took shape. We called it the Horizon Initiative. The first group of mentees came from small towns, immigrant families, and second-chance careers. I met with each of them personally. Some were shy, some skeptical, but their eyes carried the same spark I used to see in the mirror, the spark of someone ready to rewrite their own story. One evening, after a long session with the group, I returned to my office to find my mother waiting in the lobby. She'd flown out unannounced, her hands folded tightly around a small box. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "Never," I replied, though my heart beat faster. We sat in the quiet corner near the window, where the city lights stretched like golden threads across the glass. She opened the box, revealing an old photograph: me at 8 years old, holding a science fair trophy, with both hands smiling shyly at the camera. The edges were creased, the colors faded. "I found this in a drawer," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I kept it, but I never framed it. I think I was afraid to show how proud I was. I didn't want your father to think I was favoring you." Her confession landed softly, not as a wound, but as a truth finally given air. I reached for her hand. "You don't have to explain anymore," I said. She nodded, tears glinting under the warm light. "I just wanted you to know. I see you now." I always should have. The simplicity of those words filled the space between us. We sat there for a long time, the city breathing around us, no more explanations needed. When she left, she hugged me tightly, the photograph still between us. I watched her walk toward the elevator, her figure reflected in the glass doors, until they closed. It felt like the last page of a long, unfinished chapter, finally turning. That night, I drove home with the windows down. The sky above the bay was clear, a wide canvas streaked with faint silver clouds. Streetlights glimmered against the waves, each reflection breaking and reforming as the water moved. It reminded me of something Dr. Martinez once said that healing isn't about erasing the past, but about learning to see beauty through the cracks it left behind. In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known before. Mornings started with quiet walks by the water. Evenings ended with candles and books instead of endless work emails. My home felt lighter, warmer. I still called my parents once a week. Sometimes the conversations were short, sometimes awkward, but always genuine. That was enough. Kyle called too less often, but with purpose. Once he sent a photo of the small apartment he'd furnished himself, secondhand furniture, sunlight on bare walls, a single plant in the window. "Feels like starting over," he'd written. I replied, "That's the best kind of beginning." And I meant it. The first time I visited him and Vanessa in that new place, they cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy. Pasta, garlic bread, a bottle of red wine. We laughed over old memories, the painful ones softened by time and understanding. At one point, Vanessa touched my arm and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How everything fell apart just so it could finally be real." I smiled. Sometimes that's the only way things fall into place. When I left that evening, the air outside was cool and sweet with the scent of rain. The city lights shimmered on the pavement like tiny stars scattered at my feet. Back home, I placed my father's letter beside the old photograph my mother had given me. The two sat side by side on the shelf, one a beginning, the other an acknowledgement. Together, they told the whole story. The next morning, I stood by the window, watching the sun climb slowly over the bay. The water shifted from gray to gold light, rippling like silk over the surface. Somewhere below, the world was already in motion, boats leaving the harbor, gulls circling the piers. But up here in the quiet of my apartment, everything felt suspended. I breathed deeply, the kind of breath that fills every corner of your chest and makes you feel alive in your own skin. The ache was gone. In its place was a calm certainty that I'd carried myself through every storm I'd once feared. Some wounds never vanish. They just stop leading the way. And some peace doesn't arrive as forgiveness, it arrives as acceptance, like sunlight finding the water after years of fog. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you've ever learned to find peace on your own terms, share it below. Your story might help someone else find theirs. Thank you for listening. And remember, quiet strength is still strength, the kind that stays